Hi, I'm Kathy Neufeld Dunn. I'm the Associate Conference Minister for Western District Conference in MC USA. One of my main responsibilities is being resource advocate for our conference. And as part of that call, I've been working with Shanna Peachy-Bosart on the Anabaptist Faith Formation website and its related website, The Gathering Place. So Shanna asked me to host this study circle today, and which has now turned into a three-way interview. So I'm really delighted to be here and to have this opportunity to do this. Way, way back, I was a service venture leader for a trio of intrepid young women in Pennsylvania. And that was just an amazing experience to see the faith development that happened even in those 3 weeks with those young women, and as well as many trips to Chicago with junior high youth during my time in ministry earlier on. So at this point, I'd like to welcome somebody else who's with us today, our special guest, Krista Dutt. Hey, Krista, tell us a little bit about why you're here and why did Mennonite Mission Network ask you to write Merge?
I believe there was a real desire to do trips better. There are lots of folks that, Mennonite organizations that host groups like SWAP and DOOR, and there are a host of other groups that do that. But for groups that wanted to do something on their own, there wanted to be a plan in place for groups to do that. So because I was working as a program director for DOOR at the time, they reached out to me and asked me if I would write this.
Very cool. And just in case you haven't seen Rachel before, Rachel Gerber's here being our techie for this organizational, for this great time together. So why use Merge particularly for Anabaptist youth service trips? Talk about some of the Anabaptist particularities or distinctives.
I think that Merge does a pretty good job on understanding the community aspect that service trips can provide. I think in general, service trips do sort of form a community fairly quickly, but understanding the intentionality of that, which as someone who didn't grow up Anabaptist and has come to it, I feel like some of those intentional steps to be who we say we are is an Anabaptist thing. And so I think in order to have groups be intentional and not just sign up for a trip, not just sort of plan a trip and say, we'll deal with it when we get there, but to sort of intentionally, it happens. To intentionally think through these steps of how we are going to live out our faith on a trip, and make a covenant. One of the sessions is about making a covenant with each other, and to go forth on this journey together, which the journey is you're following Moses's journey through life, but you're also following your own faith journey and figuring out the different steps along the way.
You indicated that some groups do a little bit better than others in their preparation beforehand. Tell us some stories, Krista. Tell us a story about a group that did a really wonderful job of preparing their youth and all the benefits that had for them, and a group that had some significant problems because they seemingly had little or no prep.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I used to ask groups to do before they got here was to ask people in their hometown that would remember 50 years beforehand.
Wow.
And ask what were some things about the town then? And what are the things that happened 50 years ago that shaped their town as they know it now? So when people had done that, they were then ready to understand the significance of 50 years ago. So when people would come to visit me in Chicago, because I worked for DOOR Chicago when I wasn't the program director, they would be willing to understand that the economic downfall 50 years ago was still playing out in the neighborhood they were staying in. So not only were they had invested time, but hopefully they also invested time in their own neighborhood and understanding that neighborhood, and then being able to apply that knowledge. So I think taking the time, that was important. I think also groups that did a really good job knew that this was going to be a different experience. Didn't bring their own, didn't want to bring everything that they knew about home and just transplant it right into another place.
Wait, you mean that, I don't know, Chicago is different than Moundridge, Kansas?
Yeah, I mean, who
knew? Yeah, all right.
So one of the best groups I ever had actually was a group of conservative Mennonite group that had actually broken off of the Amish in the lifetime of the junior high and high schoolers that were coming on this trip.
Wow.
They understood the idea of being stared at. They understood what it meant to be on the outside. And so when they came to Chicago, they didn't treat people like that. They didn't stare at people. They didn't, because they knew what that felt like. So even if that's not people's experience, to take time and recognize that those are our tendencies to, when we see something that we don't understand, is to stare, or to at least stare figuratively at that and in puzzlement. And so those were some of the best examples. I think
you had told me earlier about, in terms of the other flip side of this coin, that there was a group from the Deep South who had apparently not done enough preparation. What happened with their experience?
Yeah, so that experience, they came and they were on public transportation as a part of the trip, and they felt stared at. They heard comments about being the only white people on the bus, which did happen. But then their response to that would encourage more of that stereotyping of them on the bus. And so that happened every day that they were there. And then they came away from their experience saying that even though they were living in the Deep South at the time, that Chicago was the most segregated city that they'd ever been in, which is a true fact. And that they never had experienced racism. Even in the South, there's no racism like this. Chicago is just this weird place where there's racism still. And so not being able to sort of see themselves as a part of that system shows that their preparation for it really lacked. I mean, I think one of the things is that we all think we're going to do service on these trips, which is true. That's a very true statement. But we have to be in the mindset that not everyone wants to be served, and that we will be served in these trips. And so when you're not ready for those things, of course, they'll want me, but not everyone on the bus wants you. They're just trying to get to work. And if you're not willing to sort of embrace the whole experience, your time might be lacking.
Thanks. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about Youth Service Trip 101 basics. What do you hope for when a new youth service, short-term service group would come to Chicago to Door? What would you hope that they would have done ahead of? Well, they would have done ahead of time. We covered some of that, but what absolutely do you have to do to have a successful service trip? If you've never planned one before as a sponsor or a youth pastor.
I think number one, if this is the first trip of yours, if it's the first trip of your churches, if this is a new venture completely, go with someone that does this. I don't work for Door anymore, but Door would be an option. Swap would be an option. I do work for MTC, so I guess that's a plug. But Or there are lots of other organizations that do this every week. They have a group. This is not new to them. If it is brand new, that is a way that you can learn how it goes without traumatic results happening on people around you and in the place that you're going. I would say that if you are, going to a place where there's not already an agency working to provide service opportunities, that you go first, that a group of adults go first, that relationships are made there. Like I talked about, like bringing a box full of stuff into a place, you don't want to do that. You want to walk alongside people. You want to do what they need. There's a really great chapter in For the Love, Jen Hatmaker's For the Love, about sort of this model. She's done both models, and she used to sort of box it in and say, of course you want everything in your town painted by junior hires, right?
Why would you not want that?
Right,
okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And she talks about sort of realizing that sometimes money is more needed than people's time, but then also to be able to sort of link up with people. So if we are going to go, it's going to be more about relationship than about doing. I think that's a hard notion to sell to parents and churches that are paying for this, right? We want to teach service. And yes, service is going to be a part of it, but part of it, I think, realizing that these trips are going to be more about learning than they are about serving, and that's okay. So instead of painting, making sure you have everyone's house lined up to paint, you should have people that you are going to talk to, people that you are going to spend time with, maybe a youth group, a local youth group that you can meet with, and literally you don't have to plan much with those kind of gatherings because they'll figure it out, right? Maybe bring some sports equipment, but have time where youth can figure out what's similar about them and what's not similar about them, and what are they learning about their experiences together. Those relationships have been proven to be what changes people, or how people learn, and how people will say, you know what, the thing that I'm doing back home really does affect this person back there that I left during my trip. And those kind of things are going to change it. Less likely so the things that we actually plan to do service, whether it's packing boxes of food, whether it's painting something. Not that those aren't important, but the things that are going to be long-lasting are that person that you met on your trip.
Yeah. In 2010, I went with Christian Peacemaker teams to Hebron. And when you're there for 3 weeks, there's not a lot you're going to do about changing 100 years, many more hundreds of years of really, really complicated, messed up politics. But I'll tell you, there were deep relationships that were built and that could be built and maintained since then, especially with social media, 21st century communication. So yeah, I really resonate with what you're talking about. Relationships are the basis of change in the long run. Sure, if benches get painted, that's great, but yeah, relationships.
I'll add one more thing, which you're alluding to, is that reflection has to be a part of your trip.
Thank you.
If it, just like you were mentioning, you reflected on that experience. Junior hires and high schoolers may not reflect on their own. This may be a part where the adults in the room need to sort of help them focus on having some reflection time. That doesn't mean that you force them to talk, but giving them journaling time, giving them different opportunities to reflect. And then there is time using Merge to reflect afterwards, which I think is highly critical in order to, instead of having people jump off the mountaintop of a service trip, it can like sort of be, herded down the mountain, and then have this having a long-lasting effect in their faith life. I would say that that's what I desired people to have when they would come to Chicago or any of the other door sites, was that I wanted them to have a meaningful faith experience and have this be a touch point in their faith journey. If we're having people jump off cliffs at the end because they're so happy but don't know how to get back into life, then we're not doing them a service.
Yeah, for sure.
Can I jump in and ask a question, Krista?
Sure.
As it relates to that, specifically, what have you noticed, these service trips, how do you see them shifting and changing youth's faith formation or perspective? Like, is there anything in particular you've noticed or yeah, I'm just curious if you could push that out a little bit more about why these trips are important to take in terms of faith formation development.
I would say that one of the things is that God is no longer in the box of which they grew up. We had lots of groups that Chicago was the biggest city they'd ever been to. Hi, you're cute.
Real cute.
Yeah. So, we'd have these groups come and, it would take them 2 hours to get to a city the size, a third of Chicago. And so they had not been able to experience being a person that was the only white person on a bus. Or they had not they just had not been exposed to people working for social change, but were fueled by faith, or have that exposed to them. People probably did it in their hometown, but they hadn't really been set up to see that in one way. So having those experiences then have allowed people to sort of have God go like, whoa, that God is a surprising God. And that God works in very many different ways. And so, think about some of the service work as God's work, even though it doesn't necessarily seem that way. So one of the things that I did, every group that ever came through when I was in Chicago, working in Chicago's program, was working in the garden. Now, I would always tell them that when you work in these gardens, if you can't talk to the people who stop by, then you should, stop gardening and listen. Like, the gardening was secondary. But on the other hand, the importance of neighborhood gardens to the people that we would send them out to help work on these gardens, like, that literally was God's work. It wasn't just the gardening, but providing a green space where people could come and sit and talk to each other. And so expanding even the notion of service as not something necessarily we check off, but as something that who we are, and we think about these larger issues as faith issues, became more and more important. And that would be one way that I would say that people expanded their view of what faith is and who they are. But seeing people, I would always try, and this would be one of those things that if you were planning your own trip, make sure the people that you're talking to, at least some of them, are like, this is their life, right? Like, so the woman who helped run the garden program, like, her life was all about, like, creating these spaces. And she didn't necessarily talk about her faith unless you pushed her on it, but she was like, of course I do this because this is my faith coming out. Like, I'm providing a space. And I think that sometimes those faith lessons could easily be by a good staff or good volunteers be shown in your home area. But by plucking you out of your home area, you're just ready in a different way. The uncomfortability of it, you sort of have to trust God that God's in there.
Yes.
So that can feel that can fuel the ability to drive your faith a little bit further. Does that answer your question, Rachel?
Yeah, that does. I think that's really helpful. I think just to sort of, even like you said, broadening that box, that like God is already there. You're not bringing God anywhere. You're really getting on board with where God's already at. And I think, it seems like an obvious concept, but I think, for a lot of our junior high and youth, that's really sort of, a good starting spot for them. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one thing I used to say when people would arrive was that I would say, God has been here, done that, had a can of Coke, and bought the t-shirt while God was waiting for you to get here.
Nice.
Just to make it clear that, indeed, God is working here just as much as God is working at home. Just because you hear about the news differently here than you do at home doesn't mean that God's, like, not here. So, no.
Excellent. At one point earlier on, Krista, you implied that there might be some valid alternatives to expensive short-term service trips. I know this may be a little bit of a shocking, controversial idea, but hey, what are the options for engagement that might be different than personal on-the-ground engagement that have validity?
Well, I know that there are really good ways to engage with people that are the other in your community.
Okay.
And so, one of the things that I have learned about these trips is that they are all about getting you out of your own culture and putting you just right into another culture. I think that can happen, and actually would encourage people to know that can happen, like within several miles of your house, generally, if you're looking for that. And so when you're ready to do that, that actually might be, if your church is ready for that, that might be a 201, whether a service trip is a 101, because you can't see people unlike you in your area. You need to go elsewhere. But once you're ready to see in your own area the people that live differently than you, to engage in what they engage in. Maybe that's going to, you could plan a weekend of going to a church that's unlike yours, heaven forbid. You could, plan to do a service project on a Saturday with one of those churches' youth groups that's unlike yours, or across the track, or whatever is that other. I think right now I'm currently thinking a lot about, there are immigrants everywhere in this country. If we're wanting to have an involvement with the other, then reaching out to groups that are immigrants, or groups that of that work with immigrants, that will be a faith moment for folks to recognize that there is difference in their own area, and that God is not working in the box they think God is, just 2 miles away.
Yeah.
There's lots of different ways. I think one of the things is you can start bringing in authors that aren't white, Mennonite, male or female, depending on your, whatever. I think there are lots of ways to get information to folks. Start being informed by those things, or bringing those things into group settings, like asking hard questions about, if you've done a study, you could say, well, what would you imagine an immigrant or an African American, or sort of someone that's not in your circle, what would they think about what we just said about this passage? Have them be thinking,
there you go,
sort of outside the box. And that way you don't have to, you can just be at Bible study, right? But asking the question about, what do you think these people will think? And as the leader, had done some research about what that group of people is saying around that passage.
brilliant.
It's a great idea.
Yeah. That's taken me back to my seminary days of reading the Bible through, we called it third world eyes at that point. But, it just, that opens up the word in such new and vibrant, well, new to us, and ways that others have been dealing with it in so many ways in their own context, but they're new to us. So, yeah, absolutely. Brilliant, insightful, and simple, close to home.
I have a question. Can I jump in and ask another question? So you hear a lot of different terminology versus mission trips, service trips, learning experiences. What are the pros and cons? Does it matter? Does language matter? I think it does. But what, for a person that is shaping one of these types of trips, what's the preferred way of actually spinning it
I'm glad you asked that, Rachel, because I have that question too.
Oh, you do? Sorry. I should just let you do all the questioning.
No, that's great, because Krista and I didn't talk about that one, but it came up later for me thinking, I wonder if there is a better or worse way to talk about this, or just a different way to frame it. So, hey, Krista.
I think it does. I think it does. I think language does make a difference. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I try really hard not to use mission trip.
Uh-huh.
But it comes across sometimes when I'm like, well, that might be a way to use your mission trip money. If it's labeled that way in the budget or whatever. I try not to, because that we've already sort of talked about that God is everywhere, and we don't want to imply that we are bringing God anywhere. And I think for me at least, mission trip says that we are on a mission to bring God. Service trips are a good example of, I think, for me at least, it's an option. I do think that service trips are well funded, because I think still there are a lot of people in the church that want to want to send kids to do service, right? So I think that's an okay option, but I want to be honest. So I think learning trips or learning experiences are probably the better way to set the agenda. But I recognize that in order to do these learning experiences, we need budget to do them, or a lot of donations. And so if you're willing to do some work in explaining why you're calling it a learning experience, especially if you're going to a place that's really fun to go to anyway. Door has a site in Los Angeles, right? And it used to be called Door Hollywood before it was Los Angeles. Now, the reality is that Door Hollywood does not look like on the ground what we think it does. But raising money to go to Door Hollywood was always very difficult for groups, because why would you go to Hollywood to do service? So I think we need to see any of the terms, whatever terms you're using, as an educational experience for the whole congregation, about why you're using the terms that you are, what this trip's going to be like. If you're using mission trip, you might want to explain that. We're using mission trip because that's what we know it as, but really this is more about service and learning and or whatever else it is about. And I think that long-term language transition needs to happen, and I think different people are at different points. I know a church that calls it learning experience, and they fund it because everyone understands, of course we wouldn't be doing mission, or of course we wouldn't be doing service. We've just gotten there. We will just watch, right? Or, CPT, they call them delegations. I think that's, I think that's also appropriate language. I've been on delegations, and that's what it feels like. We're sort of visiting dignitaries, and people treat us really well, and we hope to learn. And I think that's a very valid way to think about it. But I know we need, if we want to commit to these, we also need to commit to money. And so how do we educate people on the language we use is also very important.
Well, I wouldn't want to, even though it's a conversation among us three today, I wouldn't want to leave some new youth sponsors or youth pastors with less experience feeling a little bit left in the dust. What do you want to highlight about Merge that we haven't talked about yet? I hope you include the rituals, the follow-up coming home ritual stuff, but anything else you want to talk about that just might be Merge 101, Merge highlights, Merge windows into Merge.
Sure. And I'd be happy to talk with anyone who's using this. So
great.
I am not off limits at all.
That's really exciting. An accessible author.
Yes. Yeah, I don't think there's a point in being an author unless I'm not, if I'm not willing to talk about it. But so I think there's a huge value in following the Moses story. I think not all kids grow up in places where it talks about the Bible is sort of their firsthand knowledge. And I think the Moses story, this is a good way to sort of teach biblical literacy, but it's also like for people who I dive into it in different ways. And so I would suggest that even if you've heard about Moses since you were in a four-year-old in your Sunday school curriculum, you would get something new out of this. And I value that this book follows the biblical story of one person trying to deal with all these different things, which include the cross-cultural component, which include the reality that these are about, like, this is one of the ways that sponsors, and youth leaders and pastors can get to know their people. Like, that's huge. So there's a chapter on that. There's a chapter on, like, how to do a trip, right? And so, and like what you do every night to reflect, like that's a real thing, and that's a pretty practical thing. So there's always more you could do, but I hope that Merge can allow you to sort of deal with the issues that you will deal with later. And I think there is value in just, even if you're not going to deal with your youth, to read it through to see like what might come up in your youth. Afterwards, so throughout, I love ritual. That might be because I grew up in mainline church, and so rituals are really important to me. And so there are several rituals throughout it. One is one based on I am the bread of life passage that's not communion, but sort of values that community aspect. There's one sort of highlighting Miriam around the gratefulness and the praise to God that she had. You make a covenant at the beginning with each other about what this trip is going to look like and what it's going to hold. And then, and I think the thing I'm most proud about of Merge is this after stuff.
Yeah.
Because I've experienced that. Before I started doing this work, I was like falling off the mountain, like, and like everyone is so happy at the end of camp and like wants to be on fire for Jesus, and like, wow, like how to capture that energy and how to transform that. And so this was the first book about short-term missions that we found that has this sort of, let's get off the mountain, but gently, and live this, maybe a hill now, like we're not always going to be on the mountain, but we're not going to have to go back to the valley. And that's really important. So celebrating God's work in the last ritual is, sort of Miriam's song, like, yay, look what God is doing, and also looking around like what we can do. I think the last session is sort of about like, okay, well, there is a food pantry in our town. There are old people that we can like go and listen to in our town. Like, what struck you wherever you went, and how can we apply that as a group or as individuals? You know, maybe some individuals come and like think like, we had this really awesome food pantry in Chicago that's called Vital Bridges, and they work with families of people with HIV. But I was just this like really happy, like, you know, just good people working there, which made it so great, right? So the people at the end of the week would be like, I'm gonna make a Vital Bridges, and I'd be like, great, maybe that's a plan for like to work on for 6 years, you know, like to sort of help people instead of not doing it at all, find what is available, and then if there's not something available and you still want to do it, like there's some value in having the youth lead us in that way, right? So making sure that all of those pieces come together.
So basically you're saying as part of the follow-up that the youth, along with their sponsors, are making an action plan of how do we carry out in our own communities what we've learned in this strange context that really isn't so strange after all.
Right.
Because there's a heck of a lot of crossover. There will always be people on the margins, no matter where we are. And we can get to know them. We can have authentic relationships. And we can work with them, walk beside them, wherever we are.
Right.
Yeah.
If as churches, we are truly about giving young people an opportunity to value their faith through a service trip, learning experience, whatever, and not just giving them a glorified vacation, then we need to consider what happens afterwards and help them sort of make those connections. And maybe not help them just as much as walk alongside them. I mean, one of the ideas in the book is to meet a month after and just sort of say, like, what's still coming up for you? I mean, the reality is this is the group that's going to understand. And when people would leave, I would say, so you're going to be able to figure out what happened at home because you've been to a baseball game, but your best friend who's not on this trip, like, is not going to be able to understand when you have a story. They'll want to listen. They can be influenced. But if you're having a, like, Chicago moment, that's what I call them, but it could be, you know, El Salvador moment or Oklahoma City moment, whatever. You're having that moment, you need to find someone in this group to process that with, because they'll understand the context. And that kind of thing, that sort of ongoing mentorship of that, like, is important. And also to keep it in mind, you know, if we're wanting this to have a lasting effect, we should be talking about those Oklahoma City moments every month. What's coming up, you know? And it's okay if there isn't an Oklahoma City moment. I am so glad I'm getting a haircut right after this. Like, literally, I'm going to go. Like,
oh, good. Yeah.
So, you know, we need to make sure that we as leaders are bringing that up. Like, is there space to talk about what happened in Appalachia and it's January, but we're saying it's not done. Nor is the big event that happened, you know, if there's a shooting or if there's another traumatic event that happens, we also need to be carrying that all year. Like, the effects of big events don't just go away after a month. And sometimes they can, but we shouldn't assume that.
And I think that also, if that follow-up is carefully tended, then youth can also continue to reflect and make those faith connections wherever they are. And presumably at some point, they start to make those faith connections in their own home context as well. Rachel, you got anything else? Anything you hoped we'd cover that we haven't yet?
I think that's about it. Yeah, do you just have any like last bit of advice, like don't go home without knowing this, for any sort of youth worker planning a trip?
I would say that I think the three of us have probably heard bad things about service trips, or and I think we need to acknowledge that reality. That when mission trips, I'll use that intentional. That when they go wrong, they can go really wrong, and not just for the people in them. They can go wrong for the people that we are supposed to be serving. So to do an intentionally well thought out, relationship driven experience is really important. And knowing what we don't know is really helpful. Like knowing what we need to rely on local people for is really valuable.
Good word. Don't do it alone.
And knowing what you don't know.
Yeah.
That's actually a fine mindset for service learning trips, but yeah, exactly, for life.
Right.
Thanks so much, Krista, for your work with this. I know writing books are not for the faint of heart, so thank you for putting your heart and soul in this for this amazing practical resource that I'm sure is blessing so many people. So hopefully they take advantage of that.
Yeah, thanks for asking me.
Yeah.
It's nice to pull it off the shelf since I don't do this work every day anymore.
You got a chance to reflect on your own experience.
Yeah.
Yay.
Yep. Actually, I was telling someone in my small group that I was going to be doing this, and she said, well, I bet you could write that about several other things. And I said, and I'm hoping right now that no one asked me to do that. So I'm really glad that it got written and that I got a chance to write it. But I'm also feeling like practicing some of it more than writing it is also fun.
Yeah.
Good thing. Different seasons of life bring different emphases.
Yes.
We both have little ones, so that gives life a different aspect of when they're grown and gone.
Rachel, I am so glad that your little one came in, because I've started expecting my little one to come in, and I was thinking then we can be just like the baby.
I know, I thought about that. I was like, do I stiff arm him? No, I wouldn't. Yeah, bring him here. Yeah.
That was great.
I know. You never know. But yeah, I'm so grateful for this time that we were able to have together. And thanks, Kathy, for your leadership with hosting this call, and Krista for taking the time to do this. So next month, actually, I think that this is a really nice tie-in for what the next month is going to be for the Gathering Place, which is we're actually talking about convention, which is another type of learning experience going into a city. And part of that will be experiencing different culture. Depending on where you're from, worship might look different. And how do we sort of engage with that? How do we engage with the local city that we're in? So yeah, a lot of, I think, really nice tie-ins between what you were able to offer and where we'll be going next month. So thanks for that. So yeah, well, until next time, be well and take care. Thank you.